The S&P 500 is one of the world's most popular indexes, and it's generally considered a good option for the average investor. But what if you have millions of dollars to invest? Is the S&P 500 still the best option, or is there a much better place for you to potentially put your money? Well, over the past 20 years, I've been helping high-earning expats with exactly this question, and today I'm going to share the answer with you. The first thing we need to do is to understand how the S&P 500 actually works and why it's flawed, because lots of people get this wrong and it can have a huge impact upon their wealth further down the line. So if we think about the US stock market like a mountain, then the S&P 500 is like the peak. It represents the top 500 companies within part of the US market at time, ones like Apple, Microsoft and Nvidia. And although these companies themselves can move up and down all the time, by investing in the S&P 500, you're investing in the overall success of the US economy. Now, naturally, investing in the S&P 500 has some big pros. Since it started off in 1957, the annual returns of the S&P 500 have been about 10% on average. In other words, if you'd invested 100K in January 2022, 12 months later, you'd have made an extra 10,000. And in the last decade, the returns on average have actually been higher than this. That's a staggering 14.7%, which beats a lot of the other possible investment options out there. However, before you turn off this video and jump straight onto your investing platform, despite these very good results, there are 4 very good reasons why high net worth individuals might not want to invest only in the S&P 500. So the first reason is recency bias, and given the stellar performance of the S&P 500 over the last few years, it's easy to just see the upside. But most investors are entirely unaware of what is known as the lost decade. This was the period between January 2000 and 2010 when the S&P 500 went backwards at an average of almost 1% per year. Now, there are very few investors I know who'd be happy with a negative return after an entire decade of investing. I don't think many of us would have held that investment all that time. Human nature is just to give up and to sell. Your average investor sells during periods of pain, often because of lack of diversification, then buys when the price has risen again during periods of euphoria such as now. But this behavior sets you up for failure and makes investing feel like a roller coaster, when it should feel much more like a long and gentle train ride. Another reason I wouldn't rely entirely upon the S&P 500 is just the selection process. You'd think that such a famous index might have lots of complex algorithms behind it, but no. The top 500 companies are selected by committee. And whilst it's potentially a relief that AI hasn't taken over everything just yet, this does leave room for error because human judgment isn't perfect. Factors such as bias, oversight, and the desire to build a great advert for the US economy all come into play. And this can make it very difficult to recreate past successes in the future. Now, the third reason requires us to zoom out a little bit and to take a better look at what we are actually investing in. Because up until this point, I've just been talking about one mountain, which is the US stock market, which at 50 trillion US dollars in size, or 61% of the world's equity market capitalization, cannot be ignored. But just 35 years ago, it only accounted for 29%. And guess who was number 1? Japan. This shows just how quickly things can change in the global economy. And when we look at the details, we can see the lost decade below between 2010 versus the rest of the US market here. Now, let's look at the stellar performance of the S&P 500 over the subsequent decade on this graph here. If we combine them together, we can see over 20-year average returns. And the S&P 500 has done well, but not as well as other aspects of the US market or the world. Last year, it was Hungary that was the world's best performing country, with their stocks growing a whopping 50.9%. And before this, it was Turkey. Before that, the Czech Republic. And before that, it was Korea who were the top dogs. The US hasn't actually been the top performer in the world in any single year in the last 2 decades. Although admittedly, it has always consistently been a strong performer within developed markets. But do you really trust a small part of the US economy to always remain stable for decades to come? I personally wouldn't always bet on it. And the fourth reason combines all of this reasoning together. I would not recommend the best known index in the world because it's the best known index in the world, which means that despite its not being the best performing, it's very popular with investors and therefore possibly expensive to buy. So what should you potentially consider doing instead? Well, to put things into context, had you invested $100,000 in 1972 into the S&P 500, that would have grown to $13 million by today. That same amount of money invested in a systematic portfolio in 1972 with global stocks and tilts would now be worth $39 million. So that is a difference of $26 million. Now, for the average investor investing $100 per month into index funds, that might not seem very impressive. But when you're a high net worth individual investing millions of dollars, it is really worth investing your time looking into this. Global diversification has proven time and time again to return more and have lower volatility than any individual country. So my recommendation for high earners is generally to own a portfolio of low-cost funds invested in all of the great companies of the world, including the S&P 500, but meaning to own the whole world, not just the US. Don't put all of your focus just on that one peak when there's an entire mountain range out there for you to invest in. However, even if you are well off, investing in a diversified set of stocks will only get you so far, and I often work with very high earning expats who just can't retire even though they're earning 6 or even 7-figure salaries each year. So check out this video next where I break down the most important mindset shift rich people need to take if they want to build generational wealth.